We often think about wars being won by bigger armies or better technology. But this is a different kind of story. This isn't just about a weapon. It's about a collision of ideas, a brutal clash between two totally opposite ways of thinking, fought in the hellish jungles of the Pacific. It's about what happens when one side's deeply held belief in their own spiritual superiority runs headfirst into the cold, hard math of industrial firepower.
And that brings us to the real question at the heart of all this. How does a simple 30-year-old hunting gun, a gun designed for shooting birds, end up systematically dismantling a military doctrine built on the idea of an invincible warrior? The answer, as you'll see, tells us something really profound about the nature of war, about innovation, and about that critical moment when a deeply held belief crashes into reality.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll dig into the Japanese doctrine they were so sure would bring them victory. Then we'll introduce our unlikely hero, the shotgun. We'll see them collide in the jungle, explore the incredible innovation that followed, and finally, we'll unpack what it all means in the long run.
To really understand why the shotgun was such a shock to the system, you first have to get inside the mindset of the Japanese military. What the Americans were up against, well, it wasn't just an army, it was an entire philosophy of war, a belief system they were willing to die for.
So what was this doctrine all about? It really all boiled down to one single powerful idea, that the Japanese spirit, their Yamato Damashi, was their ultimate weapon. They were absolutely convinced that the training, the discipline, and the sheer willpower of their soldiers made them unbeatable in close-quarters combat. Their entire strategy was built around getting in close, where a bayonet charge could decide the battle. They believed their fighting spirit would simply shatter their opponents. And you know what? In the early days of the war, in China and against the British in Singapore, it actually worked, which of course only made them believe in it even more fiercely.
And when you put that philosophy side by side with the American way of war, wow, it is a night and day difference. The Japanese doctrine, it's all about spiritual strength, surprise night attacks, which they called kishu, and the absolute glory of the bayonet charge. Their own training manuals, which the U.S. War Department later studied, claimed Americans were soft, too dependent on their gadgets, and would break in a close fight. The American doctrine, on the other hand, it was a machine, a giant industrial machine built on firepower, technology, and overwhelming the enemy with sheer material superiority. We're not just talking about two different playbooks here. This was a complete collision of worlds.
So you've got these two completely opposite ideas about how to win a war, hurtling towards each other. And what steps into the middle of this epic clash? Not some brand new high-tech rifle, not a top-secret weapon. Nope, it's a complete underdog, an old-timer that honestly had no business being on a modern battlefield.
And here it is, the Winchester Model 12. I mean, just look at it. This thing's design was from 1912. It was a civilian's gun for hunting. Now, the military version, the M12 trench gun, had a few tweaks, a shorter barrel, a heat shield so you wouldn't fry your hand, and yep, that's a lug for sticking a bayonet on it. But its most critical feature, the one that would change everything, wasn't something new they added. It was something they didn't take away from the original design.
And this number is everything. 54. Let that sink in for a second. A single Marine, using a technique called slam fire, could spray an area with 54 separate projectiles in less than 3 seconds. See, each shell was packed with 9 lead balls of double-aught buckshot. The gun held 6 shells. You do the math. It was a literal wall of lead. It was a kind of firepower that the Japanese doctrine, with its focus on slow, deliberate bolt-action rifles, had absolutely no answer for. It was more lead in 3 seconds than a Japanese soldier could fire in an entire minute. So, what is this slam fire thing? Well, funny enough, it's not a bug, it's a feature. See, modern pump-action shotguns have a safety mechanism called a trigger disconnector. It forces you to pull the trigger for every single shot. The old Winchester Model 12, it didn't have that, which meant you could just hold the trigger down, and then every single time you rack the pump back and forth, psh, psh, bang, a shell would fire. It effectively turned a simple shotgun into a close-range manual machine gun, spitting out lead as fast as a man could move his arm.
And if you're thinking, wow, that sounds absolutely brutal, you are 100% right. This weapon was so vicious, it already had a fearsome reputation from the last World War. Get this. This is a real quote from a formal diplomatic protest filed by the German government during World War I. They considered the shotgun so inhumane that it caused unnecessary suffering that they actually tried to have it banned as a war crime. They even threatened to execute any American soldier they captured carrying one. The US rejected the protest, of course, but it just goes to show you, this weapon was a certified monster in close combat, long before it ever landed on an island in the Pacific.
Okay, so now let's go to the proving ground. Let's head to the battlefields of the Pacific, places like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and let's see what happened when that doctrine of spiritual superiority ran smack into the mechanical reality of the Model 12.
You have to picture this environment. The Pacific wasn't like the fields of Europe. It was a nightmare. We're talking dense, suffocating jungle where you could barely see 10 feet in front of your face. Ambushes were constant, the Japanese were masters of using the night to infiltrate your lines, and as the war dragged on, they dug themselves into these islands, creating these insane, complex networks of fortified caves and bunkers. In that kind of fight, your standard, accurate, long-range rifle, it's almost useless. The battle was always going to be close, brutal, and personal, which, ironically, is exactly the fight the Japanese wanted, or so they fought.
And in those confined spaces, a new kind of terror was born. When Marines fired a shotgun into the mouth of a cave, those 9 lead pellets wouldn't just fly straight. They'd hit the hard rock walls and ricochet everywhere, creating what the Marines who saw it called a lead storm. We even have accounts from Japanese survivors who said the sound inside was a metallic, shrieking noise that seemed to come from every direction at once. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. In those tight spaces, it was pure psychological terror.
The Marines didn't wait for a manual to tell them how to use this thing. They figured it out on the spot. In the jungle, they learned you don't aim for a person you can't see. You fire at a sound, a flicker of movement, and let the spread of the buckshot do the work. At night, they'd fire low along the ground to stop Japanese infiltrators from crawling into their foxholes. And they even invented this incredible technique called skip shooting, deliberately bouncing the buckshot off a cave wall like a billiard ball to hit enemies hiding around a corner. That is tactical adaptation at its most raw and brilliant.
By the end of the war, on islands like Iwo Jima, this on-the-ground innovation had evolved into a formal system. They called it the blowtorch and corkscrew, and it was a team effort for taking out the toughest bunkers. First came the blowtorch. A flamethrower team would roast the entrance to keep heads down. Then the corkscrew, a demolition team, would run up and blast the position open. And then came the final push. Specialized teams armed with shotguns would rush in and clear the inside with that overwhelming close-range firepower. The shotgun had found its perfect place inside the American war machine.
But here's the thing, and this is probably the most important point of this entire story. The success of the Model 12 isn't really about the gun. It's about what the gun represents. It's a story about the American philosophy of war itself, one of adaptability, industrial power, and most critically, trusting the soldier on the ground.
The production numbers tell the story perfectly. The U.S. produced about 6 million M1 Garand rifles. That was the main weapon for everybody. But they also produced over 60,000 of these Model 12 shotguns. Now that might not sound like a huge number in comparison, but it shows you the shotgun was a specialized tool. It symbolizes an industrial power so vast that it could afford to design and supply specific solutions for specific problems. Japan, which was struggling just to produce enough basic rifles for its soldiers, simply could not compete on that level.
And that gets to the real heart of the matter, this idea of bottom-up innovation. It's a fancy term, but what it means is simple. The most effective tactics weren't being dreamed up by generals looking at maps miles away from the fight. They were being discovered through trial and error by terrified, exhausted, but incredibly clever Marines and soldiers in the mud and the caves. This is the absolute opposite of the rigid top-down Japanese command structure, where deviating from established doctrine was actively and often harshly discouraged.
Just think about it. That skip shooting technique we talked about. That was born out of pure necessity by some guy in a cave trying not to die. Soldiers figured out on their own that mixing buckshot shells with solid slug rounds gave them more flexibility. The creation of specialized shotgun assault teams was an on-the-ground decision made by a squad leader, not a general. And crucially, these tactics spread informally, just by word of mouth from one unit to the next. That rapid, user-driven adaptation was America's real secret weapon.
Okay, so let's zoom out one last time and look at the lasting impact of this humble shotgun. What does its story tell us about warfare then and now?
Now, it's important to be clear. The Model 12 was not a magic bullet. It was a specialist tool, and it had very clear weaknesses. Its firepower under 50 yards was absolutely unmatched. But beyond that range, a soldier with a shotgun was a sitting duck for anyone with a rifle. The ammo is heavy and bulky, and the weapon needed constant cleaning in the Pacific's corrosive environment. It excelled in its niche, but that niche, the jungle, the trench, and the cave,
just happened to be the defining battlefields of the entire Pacific War. And the lessons learned were definitely not forgotten. The combat shotgun remained a key part of the U.S. military's toolbox for decades. It saw service in the close-range battles of Korea and was used extensively in Vietnam for the terrifying job of clearing the Viet Cong's tunnel networks, a direct tactical evolution from the cave fighting on Okinawa. The Pacific War proved its worth beyond any doubt.
Which brings us all the way back to our central question, but maybe framed a new way. When a rigid, deeply held doctrine meets the brutal, unpredictable reality of a fight, which one is forced to bend? The Japanese doctrine of spiritual superiority shattered because it could not adapt. It had no answer for an enemy that brought overwhelming specialized firepower to the fight, and even more importantly, allowed its own soldiers to invent new ways to use it on the fly. The story of the Model 12 isn't just about a gun. It's a powerful lesson that adaptability, innovation from the ground up, and a pragmatic willingness to use the right tool for the job will often triumph over the most deeply held beliefs. And it reminds us that, whether you're on a battlefield or in a boardroom, maybe the most dangerous strategy of all is to believe your own plan is infallible.